Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Genealogical Society of Santa Cruz County Lecture Series Part 2 with Gordon Seyffert. It is October 4th, 2022, and this meeting is being recorded. To join this event using a telephone only, dial any of the following numbers, and I'll read one of them aloud: 1-888-788-0099, and then slowly enter the webinar ID of 868-6905-5088. And we are taking questions. If you're joining by computer, you can use that Q&A feature to type your questions. So down on the Zoom control bar, the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A icon. So if you click on that, you can enter in your question. And then if you're on a mobile device, the Q&A icon likely appears at the top right corner of your screen because that's where the Zoom control bar is. And I'm now going to turn things over to Gail.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon. We are glad to see all of you here for today's program. This program is presented in partnership with the Santa Cruz Public Libraries on the library's Zoom meeting platform. We thank our wonderful library partners, Sarah Jones, Victor Willis, and Jessica Goodman, for their assistance in supporting our programs. The Society's DNA Special Interest Group held its monthly session earlier today. The DNA SIG will meet next on Tuesday, November 1 at 10 a.m. The DNA group meets in the upstairs meeting room at the downtown library. Look for reminder notices about the time and place of the next session. All the handouts from the DNA Special Interest Group can be accessed via the Genealogical Society webpage under the category Lecture Recordings and Handouts. Just a reminder, the upstairs meeting room in the library is reserved by the Genealogical Society for our Tuesday meetings, including Zoom meetings. The Society displays the Zoom presentations on the large monitor, and Society members are available after the programs to answer any questions that attendees might have. It's a fun way to participate in the Zoom programs in person. For details, contact Mike Epperson or join us at 1 p.m. in the library meeting room. In a moment, I will introduce today's speaker. First, though, we have just a few announcements. If you have not yet signed up to be a volunteer staffer, please join us. Dancy Giroux and Mike Epperson will host a staffer orientation session on Thursday, October 20 at 1:30 p.m. in the genealogy room at the downtown library. It's easy and fun, and the orientation will get you started. We staff the genealogy room Monday through Sunday. Each shift is only 2.5 hours long, and it's an opportunity to become more familiar with our reference collection. Our staffing roster will be complete if each of you will help by staffing just one day a month. Please volunteer to staff by emailing the Society at staff@scgensoc.org, and later on we will put those links in the chat for you. The fourth quarter issue of our Society newsletter has just gone out. You should receive it shortly if you have not already received it. The next quarterly edition will be the January, February, March 2023 issue. Send articles about your genealogical endeavors, successes, and research tips to our editor, Lisa Robinson. We also hope to feature your genealogical brick walls in upcoming newsletters, so tell us where you're stymied. Our November program will feature Dan Modell, who will present the history of the Eberts, an early Santa Cruz family, and their longtime local business. Mr. Modell will bring the Ebert story to life through a documentary film he has created. As members know, we do not present a program in December. In lieu of our monthly program, we will enjoy a holiday luncheon at the Crow's Nest on Thursday, December 1 at 11:30 a.m. The cost for the luncheon is $40 and includes entree, salad, non-alcoholic beverage, tax, and tip. Members and guests are welcome. Come see how much fun genealogists can be. Now, let's get to today's program. Today, we're delighted to welcome back Gordon Seyffert as our speaker. Mr. Seyffert is president of the Immigrant Genealogical Society of California and today he will examine questions submitted by you, our attendees. Some of you have already submitted questions at the time you registered to attend this program. But if you have not yet submitted a question about how to research your German immigrant ancestors, we invite you to do so. You may enter your questions by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. While we cannot guarantee that Mr. Seyffert will be able to answer every single question, he will answer as many questions as he possibly can today. This program is intended to be a dynamic conversation, therefore there will be no handout. The program will be recorded and available on the Santa Cruz Library's YouTube channel, however, so you will be able to review the presentation again in the future. Gordon Seyffert is a retired university staffer who was born in St. Louis. His ancestry is half from Germany and half from the British Isles. His primary interest is German genealogy, since several of his ancestors immigrated to the US in the mid-19th century. He is especially interested in migration and the factors that cause people to relocate. Gordon says that he is a genealogist because he is a curious person who wants to know from whence he came. He categorizes himself as a lifelong learner. He refuses to be intimidated by problems of unfamiliar language and culture. Gordon is proud to be a talented amateur who enjoys helping others. And today he's going to help all of us by answering our questions. We are extremely honored to have Gordon Seyffert with us again today. Please join me in giving Mr. Seyffert a warm Zoom welcome.
Thank you. I want to start out by doing a little show and tell, if I may, and I'm just going to hold things up to the camera. One of the major sources I used for addressing the first questions that came in, 18 in number, by the way, were the syllabi from the 3 conferences of the International German Genealogy Partnership. The first one was held in 2017 in Minneapolis, St. Paul. The second one in 2019 in Sacramento. And the third one, due to COVID, was only by Zoom. It was supposed to have been in Cincinnati. And I guess in some measure it was headquartered there, but it was entirely by Zoom. So there was no personal connection, which was unfortunate. The syllabus for the first one is this one. I don't know, you can get a screenshot, but it is a paper copy. I don't know that there is a USB version of it available. The second one comes both in a thumb drive or in this paper copy. Again, I'll try to hold it still. And a lot of the information in that one was very, very useful. For 2021, I don't believe there was a physical copy of the syllabus available, but you could purchase the entire syllabus in visual aids as well. There we go. We're getting some images. But there are other things that I have in my personal library here, which you can partially see behind me, that I would just like to briefly mention, because I think that any beginning or intermediate genealogist needs to be looking to libraries for reference books. Well, the first one I'm going to mention is the German Research Companion, and the primary author was Shirley Reamer from the Sacramento Society, and this is now in its 3rd edition, but you should be able to find one of the 3 editions at least at your local library. Another thing that I will mention is Across the Atlantic and Beyond, the Migration of German and Swiss Immigrants to America. And I mentioned that because of, as I heard in the introduction, I mentioned that I was primarily interested in migration. I'm not an authority on migration, but I just find it fascinating. Here is another one. George Schweitzer was a very well-known author and lecturer. This is not very graphic because there's no picture, but I think this is worth finding if you can. And James Beidler is a good source. Let me see if I can get, yeah, there's the author's name. He's very active with the IGGP, and this is a good source for guiding you to your online sources. From Minnesota, I'm not sure this is still in print, but it's a huge book. Germanic Genealogy, 3rd edition. You can see how thick this thing is. And it's very useful. Now then there are some older things. Here is the syllabus and program for the Sacramento German Genealogy Society's 2013 meeting. And inside, one thing I should mention is there's a page on finding your German place of origin, which gives a lot of suggestions about what you might be examining in your own home or local resources. So you can go to other meetings. Also, of course, the Sacramento German Genealogy Society put out the quarterly Der Blumenbaum for 25 years under Shirley Reamer's editorship. And there is this guidebook to the topics in the early ones. This only goes up to 1993. But again, it is possible to consult some sources to find maybe indexes here and there to articles. Lastly, I'll mention that sometimes you can find good reference works that talk about local holdings, and this is one for Southern California. It's from 1992, but it could show you what's available down here, and I suspect there's probably something comparable for Northern California. And there's all kinds of books on separate regions of Germany, but one I particularly like, and I was able to pick up my own personal copy for Baden-Württemberg. This is a valuable resource. I don't know how well you can see the print on that, so I'm going to open it up to the title page. Let's see, there we go. Now that's actual queries, so it may or may not have your family, but there's just so many things available for southwestern Germany because it was part of the German Federal Republic. Unfortunately for me, my people coming in the 19th century came from either what the Germans call Middle Germany, which we would refer to as East Germany, the communist German Democratic Republic, or even farther to the east, I had some people coming from East Prussia, which now is, depending upon which part I'm discussing, is either Russian or Polish. So, not so much published in those areas. I'll start with the first question. Mary Trotter was interested in Germans from Baden-Baden in the mid-1800s. So I have to mention in that 2019 syllabus, there's a topic that relates to this by, what is her name? Teresa McMillan, I think it is. Teresa Steinkamp McMillan. And she's talking about the excellent resources on Family Search and Ancestry.com that relate to Baden and Württemberg. In the Ancestry site, there is a collection on Germany births and baptisms from 1558 to 1898. So that would be the starting point for anybody that's trying to find birth, marriage, death records for that area. But also, there's an immigration index for Baden-Württemberg. And then on the Landesarchiv for Baden-Württemberg, their collections can be searched by using the term Auswanderung and then the surname that interests you. And this brings home a point that if you're doing searches on German websites, you want to use German terms if you can. So Auswanderung just means emigration. Now, I will also mention, I did go looking in the Map Guide to German Parish Registers, which we have complete at the Immigrant Genealogical Society Library. And if you're familiar with that source and you have a town, you can look up and see not an actual map, but a kind of a schematic map showing the relation of the various parishes one to another. Half the book will always be Lutheran and the other half will be Catholic. And it will show you that the parishes are different depending upon what the population for the area was. But if you're lucky, when these were published, they had the initial film number from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Family History Library, or Family Search today, now that we're heavily digitized. But that tells you that you can get those birth, marriage, death records, hopefully, either online, digitized, or if you have to, on film, either at your local family history center or by going to Salt Lake. But for Baden-Württemberg, the parish film numbers for the Catholic parish would be 1045128, and for the Lutherans, 1189701. So I would just go to familysearch.org and go to the catalog. When you find the drop-down menu, you select catalog and you just insert that film number into the topic line, and it brings up immediately their description, not only of the initial film, but all of the films that they have for that parish. I did look at the Immigrant Genealogical Society's selection of Ortsippenbücher but unfortunately, we have none for Amt Baden. And the closest town we have is Lauf, which, by the way, I just did an article on for my newsletter a month or two ago. We have finding aids specifically for Baden, and I checked those and pulled some articles. I showed you the one book, the German Genealogical Queries and Research Reports. In there, they had some people who had Baden-Baden references. There was an Adams family that went to Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, a Mitzel family to York County, Pennsylvania, a Hombrecht family to Philadelphia, and a Durr family to Mercer County, Pennsylvania. So this shows you the power of that book. Now, the chances of one of those being your family are pretty remote, I realize, but it just shows you it's something to be checked. And we don't have many, in fact, we only have one copy of a Deutsches Geschlechterbuch, but the one we have is for Baden, and it's the fifth one in the series, and it's volume 189. Now, I suspect if you go to the Sutro Library in San Francisco, you'll find them all. If you were in Los Angeles, you'd go to the downtown Los Angeles Public Library, and they have, I think, all of them. Now I want to show you some other items. Here's another book. It's hard to see. I'm going to open up to the title page. This is a book you want to get your hands on if you can. It has a section, for instance, on Badener and Württemberger in den USA. So those families that came to the United States. So there's just all kinds of information in here, and it's worth your checking out. Next thing I found was an interesting article in Der Ahnenforscher, which is the publication of the German genealogy group of Kings Park, New York. And there's a key article here from April of 2009 talking about which Baden is which. And I'd just like to read from that quickly. There is always a greater probability that an ancestor's origins are from within the state. The present-day population of the town of Baden-Baden is still less than 50,000. So if you see a reference to Baden-Baden, another thing it tells you is that the term actually was created in 1931. They wanted to distinguish the Baden city in the Baden state from two other Badens, one of them in Austria and one of them in Switzerland. So when you see Baden-Baden, it's actually saying the Baden town that's in Baden. So that's a little confusing, but there's a 2-page article in this publication from April 2009 that will give you a little background. And now going to the other items. From the 2019 conference I mentioned, Nathan Machula, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, did a talk on researching Baden-Württemberg. And the syllabus provides 4 pages, including references on the back, websites, books, journals, and dissertations. And it gives quite a good discussion of what's available. Another thing I'd mention is Ute Brandenburg has one from, gosh, I think I didn't write this one down. I think this is probably 2019 also. And we'll get to this one later. But there is a talk here, They Rarely Came Alone. And she talks about the fan club is an important thing for research. That's family, associates, and neighbors. And interestingly, down at the bottom of the first page, She says crop failures all over Europe, particularly in 1849/50, caused hunger and a rise in commodity prices. So if you're looking for the push factor and why someone would have left the area, that's one of them to consider. It's not just the revolution of 48, it's also agricultural and food availability problems. Lastly, I'll just mention that for this person who is interested, this is Mary Trotter, I actually have a tourist brochure on Baden-Baden and a map and a collection of postcards. So if you're interested, you might contact me. So I think that covers the first one. The second question is by Denise Ellis, and she's got a brick wall with a man named Frank Krause, and she doesn't know his hometown in Bavaria. So for this, I'm going to say you probably need to contact the Bavarian Genealogical Society, which is, I think, the number 3 society or number 2 society in the DAGV, which is the German equivalent of the National Genealogical Society here. And there are 2 people in particular I would say you would want to contact. The first is the president. His name is Manfred Wegele. That's spelled Wegele. And the other one would be Sabine Scheller, and that's Scheller. They're both officers, and they're both extremely helpful. And the Bavarian Genealogical Society deals with Americans all the time, so you don't have to worry about writing in English, but you just need to find it. Also, I went to WikiTree. If you're not familiar with that, everybody uses ancestry.com and familysearch.org. But wikitree.com is a great site if you're looking for people. And I put in the name Frank Krause, and I got 214 matches. It has for each one of those matches a short description of who's being described, so it doesn't seem as imposing as it sounds when you actually get to the website. Then I'm going to mention years ago, specifically in spring 1987, in our German American genealogy journal that IGS used to publish, there was an article by Friedrich Wolmershäuser, who is an active genealogist still today, even though this is published in 1987. And the title of the article is Finding the Origins of 18th Century Immigrants from Southern Germany. And I mention that because I've got numerous copies of this publication that are still available. Also, in the 2021 conference of the IGGP, we had Marcel Elias giving an introduction to Bavarian records. I'm just going to mention that. We don't need to take a picture. Also, since you mentioned DNA, Dion Southard gave a lecture at the same conference about it's getting easier to be genetically German updated. And she's talking about the various sites. And she said that the 2 with the greatest European reference populations were 23andMe and Living DNA. But she also commented, this was actually from her earlier lecture in 2019, that as of 2019, 92% of us Germans don't show up at 23andMe. So it shows you that if you're not finding what you need in DNA matches for your German ancestry, we've still got to wait a bit. Lastly, since you mentioned a marriage in Iowa in 1850, I should mention that at the 2019 conference, Ute Brandenburg gave that lecture, which I mentioned earlier. They rarely came alone. And the important thing here is my notation that Ute Brandenburg, as of 2019, lived in Iowa City, Iowa. So here's a researcher you could hire who's going to know both the German and the Iowa end of things. So I think you need to be thinking about hiring her. The last is, and this is a little obscure, in Der Courier, which is the Journal of the Mid-Atlantic Germanic Society, December 2011 issue, there's an article by Bob Greiner called Genealogical Information Found in Historical German Legal Notices. And he gives an example of doing a search through Google's copy of a particular Bavarian official gazette for a place name and a surname and finding all of this information about real estate transactions. So you might write to me if you want to know a little bit more about this, but it's really amazing what you might be able to find online. But you need to go to these conference presentations to get the tip as to where you should be looking. So that's all for number 2. Number 3 is by Regina Selix. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And she's asking about military when Hitler was in power, in other words, the Third Reich. And my first question on that one would be, was this husband's grandfather in the Wehrmacht or in the SS? Because it makes a big difference as to what you might be looking for. If he was in the SS, that doesn't necessarily mean he was some prison camp, concentration camp guard. Half of the SS men were actually military, fighting battles. And if you were in the SS, you had to complete information about your ancestry. And there's also possibility that you can find, especially if the person is an officer, a personnel file. And all of this information can be seen at Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland, because at the end of World War II, the Americans captured the SS files. And they brought them to the United States and pored over them to find out who was actually a Nazi Party member, because they wanted to exclude those guys from government service in West Germany in the early years at least. And so we sent the originals back around about 1960, I think, to the Berlin Center. But we have copies on microfilm of all of this information. And I have viewed this myself personally, and I've also had a researcher work in the material for me. And it is amazing what you're going to find if you can find a guy with an SS file. For the Wehrmacht, there is a service. I'm going to translate this as best I can. It would be the German Service Agency for the Notification of Next of Kin of the Fallen of the Former German Army. And this is abbreviated, the German is abbreviated as capital W, capital A, capital S, and lowercase t. And I don't know how they get that from the actual title that I'm looking at, because I don't even see where the A is coming. Well, okay, maybe I do. Anyway, there is information, but I'm not really prepared to give you the full background. There's also a German War Graves Commission, and there is an online site, www.denkmalprojekt.org/en.htm. that would be the German Memorial Project, and it's the English language version of this online site. But the last thing I do want to mention in regard to World War II is that at the 2019 conference, Andrea Benschneider gave a talk, Leaving a Paper Trail, German Resources Besides Church Documents and Civil Records. And on one of the back pages, she has a paragraph specifically pertaining to military records. And she's talking about the German Red Cross Tracing Service. She's talking about something called ITS, and I'm not sure what that is. And she's talking about what you might find: muster lists, regiment, diaries and journals, individual military records, or a search for missing family members. So again, there are possibilities, and you might want to hire a researcher. The fourth one is by Manuela, no surname given. And she's got an ancestor who worked in the 1890s at a cannery in the Chicago area. Well, first thing to do is go to www.chicagogenealogy.org and see what they might have to offer. Then there are several German newspapers for Chicago, which could be searched with an ancestor's name. But of course, there's always books. And here's another book that I bought for myself, Germans in Illinois, and this is fairly recent. And so that's maybe something that could be consulted for Chicago or other areas. And then for the articles, the Illinois State Genealogical Society Quarterly for spring 1991, I'm going back a ways here, has an article on researching 19th century Germans at the Chicago Historical Society Library. So that's, looks like 3 pages of information. Again, the Illinois State Genealogical Society Quarterly. This is what it looks like. This is one from summer 1992, and it's Finding Your German Ancestors Church in Chicago. So that could be valuable, because if you're looking for immigrants, the first thing you want to find is the first German language church that they joined when they came to America, because any reference to them may have mention of their place of origin if you don't already have it. Then I mentioned in my own newsletter, or it wasn't me, it was the previous editor, I'm sorry. This is from September 2004. There was an article that we mentioned about the German Aid Society of Chicago called the Deutsche Gesellschaft, which was founded in 1854. And the society estimated that in 1909 there were 600,000 Germans in Chicago. And the records of this aid society are at the University of Illinois at Chicago. 10,000 applications for assistance, and it can give you everything including place of origin. And there's even in the German Connection, which is another worthwhile publication, in volume 19, number 4, this is from 2005, there's an update on the German Aid Society of Chicago, and it's just talking about families applying between mid-March and mid-July of 1883, and it's giving you a list of all the places that they were from. So you could see the kind of information that's available. There's an article in the 2017 syllabus by Paula Stewart Warren, They joined, they wrote, they associated, finding records of Germanic organizations and other collections. This is talking about aid societies. So, syllabus item, again, is probably not worth you taking a picture, but I cite this from 2017's conference. From 2019 conference, Astrid Adler from Tiefenort in Germany has an item here, a presentation she made on immigration history from the German perspective. And this is valuable because it talks about the poverty of her area specifically. And then there's a section of her talk on preparation for immigration, what it took to actually apply if you wanted to immigrate legally, and more specifically about how you emigrated legally. In the 2021 conference, Dr. Wolfgang Grams from Oldenburg has an article here, which I will hold up, which is talking about particular immigration agents, because for many towns there was a local agent. And so people didn't just go by word of mouth, they actually worked through somebody who had connections to the ship lines and the railroads and everything else that could help you get there. Number 5 is a complex one, and I don't know that I can go too deeply into it. Gary Nolan has a 2-part question. He's asking about immigration from the mid-18th century from Hoheneck in Württemberg to the Mohawk Valley of New York. He's wondering what the motivation of a young man in his 20s might have been in those days to come to America. And the second part of his question concerns 2 ancestors of his dad's foster parents. I guess these were his dad's foster parents, a Baumgartner and an Arndt. Well, those are 2 common, but these people came to Minneapolis in the early 1870s. And I've got a lot of information here, but I have to mention that for those of you interested in Württemberg, if you want to understand how small towns in Württemberg in particular functioned, this Mac Walker book is priceless. I had to buy it from the publisher, which is Cornell University Press, but you can still buy it by going online to Cornell University Press. And this book was published in 1971, and the forward copyright is 1998. So it's a bit dated, but if you want to know everything about how society functioned in small town Württemberg, this is the book you've got to have. Now, what else do I have? I held up earlier the book on Germanic genealogy. That's this one, the one from Minnesota. In the back of it, there's a timeline. It's Appendix A. And just on the mid-18th century, I will mention that it says from 1749 to 53 was the peak of Germanic immigration to colonial America, mostly in 1730 to 1769, and mostly from near the Rhine Valley, especially the upper and middle Rhine. So that gives you a tip. And now, speaking of young men coming to America, the 2019 IGGP conference in Sacramento has a talk by Marianne S. Wokek. I'm going to give it an American pronunciation. She has a talk, Immigration to 18th Century America as a Career Move for Young Men. So this is worthwhile because it talks about who was likely to come. And on the second page, it says it was different for privileged boys and young men. They were the ones with all the opportunity, so few of them emigrated. For boys and young men from middling backgrounds, a significant proportion among them emigrated because they had sufficient means to be able to pay for passage, or at least to get to the port and become an indentured servant when they got to America. But for poor boys and young men, a relatively small but significant proportion emigrated. Obviously, they found it harder because they had no resources whatsoever. But this is a worthwhile read if you can get it. It's 2 pages. Then Michael Lacapo talked at the 2019 conference on the German immigrant experience in the 18th century, and this is full of all kinds of information. I have an idea I should be moving along here. I'm only getting through the first 5 so far. But if you contact the Germanic Genealogy Society in Minnesota about the second part of the question, there's evidence here from 1997 of research committee activities, Germans in Minnesota project, that should be interesting. And from 2000, they've got a surname research index that also could hold answers for finding out about 2 names of people going to Minnesota. So I'm going to skip. I've got all kinds of notes here, and I'm going to have to skip to move along here. L.J. Mack was wondering about the origin town for a female ancestor. And here I have to say that the thing that you hope that you can find is a book by Roger Meinert, German Immigrants and American Church Records, that pertains to your state. Now, these are still being published. He's moving to Texas for his next target, but he started in the Midwest, and hopefully maybe the person that interests you is from the Midwest. But I had a case of a woman who belonged to the Immigrant Genealogical Society. She was from Hermann, Missouri, which is in the east central part of the state of Missouri. And she had been searching for 20 years trying to find the name of the wife in this couple that came from Germany back in the 19th century. And she had never found anything that gave her a clue. She came into the library, and the books for Missouri had just been published, and I pulled the first one down and looked up the surname of the husband. Bingo. Here is the name. And it's not just the surname itself, it's her guy. And linked to that is the name of the wife with the maiden name. It turns out that what happened was that her people came to Hermann, which is a town on the south side, south bank of the Missouri River. And they moved from Hermann to an agricultural location further south in the county. But this was a record from Warren County, which was on the north bank of the river and downstream towards St. Louis, about halfway. And it looks to me like what actually happened was that she was going to be the namesake of a niece that had been born to this couple in Warren County. He appeared to be perhaps her brother. And if you know anything about German culture, if a child's going to be christened, they usually have not only 3 given names, but 3 godparents, witnesses, sponsors, whatever you wish to call them. And they get 1 name from each of those people. And so she came to the actual christening because she was giving her name to this young niece, this newborn niece. And so finally, because another pastor took the time to record places of origin, she had her answer. And she even now knew the town that the wife came from. And it was a village not too far from the husband's, which you could imagine. So maybe she could have found it if she had poured through all the nearby church books in the neighboring parishes. But here was the answer in a published volume that I could pull off the shelf. So always turn to Roger Minor. Number 7, what inspired you to study ancestry? I'm going to skip that because we're running out of time, but I'd love to talk to you about it. I will say one thing. When you start out, you may not know a whole lot, but I think it's important to tell your story anyway, to tell what you do know, because maybe somebody later will pick up. Well, after I started working on my East Prussian ancestry and learned how to read German church books with their handwriting, I was able to get answers for myself. But before that, I didn't know a whole lot, but I knew something, and I just started. And so this is a booklet I put together. And you notice the strange title, Masurian Stew. Well, Masuria is a region of what today is northeastern Poland. And I started, just to get my kids interested, making up a simple breakfast recipe from uh, uh, Kraft cream cheese package, a recipe printed inside the packaging for the brick of cream cheese. Put together 3 items: turkey sausage, the cream cheese, and O'Brien potatoes, which were frozen and had to be thawed. And I started making this thing that I called Masurian stew. And so at the end of this little booklet, I talk about how very little remains of our heritage. This was at the time, and I was showing a clock that belonged to the store of my great-grandfather in St. Louis. And then at the very end, I talk about the Masurian stew again. I actually, this is printed from an Apple computer slideshow program that was set to music. I had the German version of I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles, and I played it during the time that I was showing my slides. And so it's making something out of nothing, making lemonade out of lemons, but I recommend it highly if you get started and don't have a lot. Just work with what you've got. Now, Steve Bauer was asking what drove such large numbers of Germans to leave their home country for America. And I've got tons of articles on immigration. And again, I'm sensitive to the fact that I'm running out of time, but I will mention some of the things that are possible here. The 2017 IGGP conference has an article by Jill Morelli, The Push and the Pull, Decision-Making of the 19th Century Immigrant. So that's the first one. Then also from 2019, Immigration from Hamburg and Bremen in the 19th Century, Causes, Circumstances, and Certificates. This is presented by Andrea Benschneider, and she's a hireable professional. James Beidler has had, I've got 3 different versions of his article contrasting German migrations, 18th century versus 19th century waves. But I've got one here, an outline from the, what is this? This must be the NGS. It says Tennessee Crossroads, Nashville, 2005. And then I've got an article from NGS Magazine by him, which is the same topic, but it's presented now as an article. And that was from 2015, the April-June issue. And lastly, he's got an outline again from the 2017 IGGP conference, but it's the same topic. So sometimes these people are giving the same talk over and over again. Fritz Jungling has a single page here, which is basically a bibliography, but he's pointing you to two important sources here, Family Search Wiki and Wikipedia itself. And he mentions 2 articles for each. So think about going to those sites. There is an article in Palatine Heritage newsletter for fall of 2018, which is talking about a book you might want to get if you haven't seen it before, Our Daily Bread, and it's talking about reasons for emigration. I have not myself read the book, but I've read the summaries that have appeared in the newsletter, and they're fascinating. Back in our own journal, which I mentioned earlier, German American Genealogy, we have a number of articles that I can pull for people. One is titled 19th Century Germany, Rural Immigration. This is from our 1996 spring issue. There's another one here, Why People Emigrated. This is from the 1996 fall issue. I mentioned earlier Friedrich Wolmer's Heuser, excuse me, I'm tripping over my tongue now, Finding the Origins of 18th Century Immigrants from Southern Germany, and from one of our one-time board members from spring of 2002, Immigrant Waves from Northern Germany. And lastly, if you can find it in the October-December 2002 issue of Der Blumenbaum, Roger Meinert has an article on bursting immigration myths. And this is well worth a review. It's only a page and a half, but there's a lot of interesting information in there. But I said at the beginning that there was a page I found listing causes for German immigration, and I'm going to run through this quickly. Compulsory military conscription was unpopular. And economic depression and overpopulation caused restrictions on marriages in the early 1800s. Then you have religious convictions, the unification of the Reformed and Lutheran churches in Prussia in 1817. Next is the decline of cottage industries due to industrialization in the mid-1800s. 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, rising grain prices. I mentioned that with respect to that chronology from the Appendix A of the Minnesota reference book. Then there's always the fact that some communities tried to get rid of their underprivileged members, and they would pay to have them go overseas. Many of them came to America. Improved transportation is mentioned because removing tolls on the Rhine, Main, and Neckar rivers made it easier and cheaper to actually reach a port city. Then land prices were increasing, but the income produced from the land didn't necessarily follow. So a lot of people found that they could sell their land or their land rights, and that would provide enough money for the emigration. So again, giving people an opportunity. Farm sizes got smaller and smaller, particularly in South Germany. In the West, the wine industry was unstable from 1830 to 1845, so that kind of goes in the bad crops category. And then all these wars, taxes and military personnel came from tradesmen, farmers, artisans, and laborers. So many of them would leave to avoid all of that for their children, if not for themselves. Mentions here the positive reports that were sent back. That includes reports of cheap land. And so that was a pull factor. You have, of course, the 1848 political refugees. And then I've already mentioned the shipping agents employing agents, many of which were in even the smallest towns and villages. So these are all reasons for emigration, and it's hard to pick which one. For my wife and I, we have 4 families or people that came over in the 19th century, and I've researched them, and I can tell you that the reason for emigration in each case was different. And it's not usually the ones that you hear about, such as, oh, they came for religious freedom or something like that, or to escape the conscription of the military. No, these were other reasons. Usually economic reasons were at the forefront. Well, I'm at 2 o'clock and I've only gotten through the first 8 of 18, and I'm wondering, can I continue here? Does Gail or Sarah want to weigh in on this? Or should I let people just answer or ask questions?
Sarah, can he continue for a while?
Sure.
Okay, well,
Go
I'll
for
keep
it.
going. And I can see I'm not going to be able to tell you everything I've found, so people may have to write to me. Cindy Fitzgerald is asking about her German ancestor's hometown, and she thinks that he came from the Kingdom of Saxony. Well, Saxony's hard, and I've done work myself with Saxony, and I do have a few recommendations here. In the 2021 conference, Kenneth Hager from the Mid-Atlantic Germanic Society talks about the United States and the Kingdom of Saxony, records of the Department of State, 1837 to 1917. So that might give you a clue as to what you might find. It's a needle in a haystack proposition, but sometimes you win. A second article from the same 2021 conference is by Lars Thiele, who is a professional in Germany whom I'm currently using myself and can recommend. But he's talking about how to find the places of your ancestors in Saxony. And because I do have Saxon ancestors, I'm using him. And he's been very good so far. One thing that you find you'll be doing if you're working on Saxony, if you can read the old German script, you want to use the family history libraries, at least microfilmed. I don't know that they're yet digitized, but they're working on it. The court records from Saxony, and by court records, I'm really talking about real estate records and inheritance records. But there is a book that I was able to purchase when I was in Salt Lake, The Court Records of Saxony. I don't know that this is generally available, but it is possible to find this. Here is the author. And it's not the Bearable that you usually hear of. I think her last name is Johnson by marriage. And this is a different one. But she's got a very detailed book on how to use the court records for Saxony. And to get a basic background, I've got to really reach back the German Genealogical Digest for the first quarter of 1989 has an article by Larry Jensen, who was the authority of his day, and it's on Germany's legal court system. And I highly recommend this particular issue if you want to find out about how the legal system, not just the court records, but the entire legal system worked in Germany, because that's going to help you if you're doing legal research on your ancestry. And lastly, because I wanted people to know that it is possible to research in Saxony, even if you can't get your hands on the church records. Well, Archeon and Matricula are going to have them sooner or later. But in the meantime, I actually put together my own little 4-pager here, which is what you do in the meantime. And it's my case study of what I was able to find just by working through those court records. And I still, of course, have copies of that. Carol, I have already contacted about your question, so I'm not going to go through a whole lot. She's got 2 families that came to St. Louis, and I'm from St. Louis, so I tried to find her ancestor. I thought maybe I had found his declaration of intention to become an American citizen in the NARA Central Plains region records, which I have worked with personally. But unfortunately, she informs me that it's the same surname, but not the same person. So we're still working. But for anything having to do with St. Louis, I would say go to the St. Louis Genealogical Society, www.stlgs.org. And there's also another society I would recommend you send a query to by email. Send it to Germans in St. Louis, but Saint is in this case just ST. Germans in St. Louis at gmail.com. And maybe they can help you. But I have information here on the St. Louis County Library, which is where the National Genealogical Society's library collection went, by the way. This is online aids and guides to German and Swiss genealogy at the St. Louis County Library. Here's an article by Dennis Northcott, who's an authority on St. Louis Germans. And this is in the St. Louis Genealogical Society Quarterly for the summer of 2020. Selected resources of the Missouri Historical Society Library and Research Center. In the back of another item, we have German research resources, selected German resources and special collections of St. Louis County Library. And that's in the St. Louis Genealogical Society Quarterly for summer 2003. I'm not showing that very well. But again, if you look, you could find good finding aids for what's available. And then there's a list of probably 10 German newspapers from St. Louis that have been added to newspapers.com. So lots of resources for St. Louis. Mary Trotter has a question on ship registries. And I've got books to recommend. I won't show them because I don't have them with me. John Coletta has a book, They Came in Ships. Michael Anuta has a book, Ships of Our Ancestors. Harold Loncourt has a bibliography of ship passenger lists, 1538 to 1825. The National Archives and Records Administration had a booklet on their microfilm for immigrant and passenger arrivals. And then there's the Philby source, the index to all kinds of passenger lists. There is a publication that we have at IGS called The Second Boat. It's from years ago, but it's lists of passengers on various ships coming to America. And I don't think it's restricted to Germans. I think it's everything. Also, as far as ship registries, check Cindy's list and go to Wikipedia and see what you can find. And Dr. Wolfgang Grams from Oldenburg has an article in the 2019 IGGP conference, and that one is about steam travel. There's an earlier one he also did on sail travel, but I would recommend the second one. Next question had to do with Prussia. Bonnie Francis wanted to know about Prussia. If you want to know about Prussia, you need to get this book, Iron Kingdom. It's by, I guess I'm going to have to show the title page, Christopher Clark, who's an Australian historian, interestingly enough. But this is probably the best book on Prussia that you'll find. And it's thick, it's detailed, and it's probably still in print and available through your box bookstore. But because I don't want to omit IGGP conference presentations, Stephen Wendt has an item here from 2021, Searching for Your Elusive Prussian Ancestors, a Case Study. So that's another one you want to get a hold of. But of course, this 2021 is not, to my knowledge, a print syllabus. You have to have somebody with the USB drive online version. Number 13, Jasmine Guerrer. I'm afraid I'm probably mispronouncing that. She's asking about the Santa Cruz Arion Singing Society. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But one of the IGGP members is the Delaware Zangerbund and Library Association. So I have a website for you that you want to check because it's going to mention other clubs besides themselves, and you probably just need to send emails asking what they know. And I'm going to spell this out. The first one is Delaware, and then Zangerbund is SAEN.org/V5_L for links.SHTML. So if you go to that particular page, you will see reference to several, mostly East Coast, tripping over my tongue again, East Coast clubs. Next is Savannah East, and she's interested in Baden-Württemberg, and she's wondering what was going on in the early 1700s. Well, again, from that chronology, from 1687 to 1697, that's before the early 1700s, but it had its effect. You had the War of the League of Augsburg, and that resulted in the French burning many towns, not only in Baden, but also what today is Saarland and the Rhineland. The French were merciless, and I understand from a friend of mine living in Saarland today that people used to name their dog after the French general whom they so despised, and that was the way that they could get back at him for burning down their town decades, centuries ago. An interesting little sidelight. The second note I will make here is that 1709 to 1711 is the first large emigration of what we call the Palatines. And I bring up again this book. This is my personal copy now, but I showed this earlier. And Michael Lacapo had that article on the German immigrant experience of the 18th century, and I highly recommend that article. That was from the 2019 conference. Moving on, Gail, you had questions about the Franco-Prussian War and the military records. And I've got several things to recommend. First of all, you obviously will have access to back issues of Der Blumenbaum. So I would refer you to 3 issues. For an article on the basics of military research, go to July-September 2005 issue. Then there's a letter by a member about their own research experience from the October-December 2008 issue. And I'll let you know here, I surprised myself, that member was me. I forgot that I'd written that letter, but came across it doing research for you. The third one is on German military research, and it's from the July to September 2016 issue of Der Blumenbaum. Next, I'll mention German Genealogical Digest. This is an older publication, but it's got some good articles. And on German military records generally, you want the summer 1995 issue. For Prussia's military records, you want 2 more issues. One of them is winter 1998, and the next one is spring of 1999. And then I'll mention a very strange little journal that we have at IGS. It's called the Festungsjournal, and that's basically the Fortress Journal. It's a journal by people who are nuts about researching the history of German forts and military encampments. And we have several issues. And so I think mostly for World Wars I and II, you're going to find things. But who knows what they've got on the Franco-Prussian War? I did not actually burst into these and look to see, but you never know. The authority on German military research today is Theresa Steinkamp Macmillan, and she has written a book specifically about Hanover military records. And this is from the 2017 conference. I'm going to hold that up. But she's got a book. I'm sure it's still in print. You can order it, and what applied to Hanover is probably also applicable elsewhere. Virginia law was asking how young men avoided fighting in the Franco-Prussian War. Well, that's something I can't speak to specifically, but I will mention that in the German Genealogical Digest, summer of 1994, on page 49, there's a list of military records, which I find quite interesting. And this is going to be hard to see. Well, I can copy that and send that to people. Basically, they're talking, among other things, about military conscription records, local militia records, conscription records, recruiting records, register of those fit for military service, and recruitment and conscription of soldiers. And those are the English rough translations of the German titles. But it's nice to have those German titles because, again, if you're going to be researching on German websites, you could use some of those words and maybe get better results. Carrie Casey was asking about European events around 1848 and did they influence the gold rush? Well, here's another book that I will mention. I'm going to hold this one up. German Americans, 1848 to 1998. And this Don Tolsman is an authority. You see a lot of books by him. But this book on the 48ers is especially valuable if you want to find out more about why people left because of the revolutions of 48 and 49. And then again, I have to go back to these IGGP conference syllabi. The 2019 conference had an article by Gerald Perschbacher, who is in one of the St. Louis German groups, and it's Darmstadt to Goldfields, one German's epic success in America. So he's giving you a case study of coming to America and coming to the goldfields. The last two I had submitted in advance, I really can't do too much on. Julia, you talked about being half German and half Czech and didn't really have a question, but said that you were appreciating the fact that we were talking about all of these things. Juliana Cheng wanted to know about anti-Chinese case files of the U.S. National Archive, and did the Immigrant Genealogical Society only involve immigrants from pre-World War II Germany? Well, we do now. We used to emphasize Northern European ancestry because the founder of our library, which started as a private library, had in her family tree Germans, Scandinavians, and British Isles immigrants. And those were her three areas of research. And we expanded to a few other areas, including, for a time, Italy and Switzerland. But we built the library based on the interests of the people who started it and then volunteered to help with it. And so, no, we have nothing really on Asian immigration. But I do know that there would be information available. I have seen lists of, for instance, Chinese immigrants coming to the coastal areas, Santa Barbara and further north, close to Los Angeles. So I think the place to go would be the Sutro Library at San Francisco, because they've got so much on everything. But we did just this year decide to specialize in German genealogy, because with the loss of volunteers and the aging of our membership, we don't have the specialists we used to have in certain other countries. So Germany is what we know, and so Germany is what we're going to do. And I'm sorry, it looks like I'm not going to get to the other questions that came in, but I did send Sarah some images that could be passed on to the first 5 of those questioners. The last question had to do with birth, death, and marriage records, and whether it was better to use German city or county records. Well, you've got 2 sources for these birth, marriage, and death records. You've got the church records and the civil records. The civil records are for whatever the jurisdiction is where the person was living, usually after 1871, unless you're dealing with areas very close to the French border. For church records, of course, you've got to go to the individual church parish or to the archive of whichever denomination it might be. And if it's Protestant, you might be able to get your information from Archeon, which is a subscription service. And then there's the Catholic source, which is Matricula. And you just go where they are. It's not going to be a question of duplication. I know that I have seen duplicate records for my people in St. Louis, because St. Louis kept separate birth, marriage, death records than did the state of Missouri when they were actually keeping those records, which wasn't always. And so you can find different information from the different records. I found my paternal grandmother's middle name only by using a St. Louis record, I think it was. The other one, the state record didn't have it, it just had a middle initial. Or maybe it was the other way around, I can't tell you now. But in Germany, it's going to be pretty cut and dried. So for question number 6, that's my answer. I don't have anything that Sarah could share with you, but for the others, at least I did copy a page that she can pass on to you. So with that, I'll just open it to any open mic questions that we might have at this point.
So Gail, what would you like to do? Because we are at 2:30.
We have what, about 20 minutes we could devote to questions. What's our timing, Sarah?
We're at 2:30.
Oh, okay. So we could host about one question.
I'm long-winded, I'm sorry, but I got so much and I
Well,
didn't
there's so
even
much.
cover everything I found.
All I can say is expect a lot of emails.
Right.
Well, why don't we take this one? It says, please repeat the contact names for the Bavarian Genealogical Society.
Okay.
And then Gordon, how would you like people to contact you?
The Bavarian Genealogical Society is actually, and I'm not a German speaker, so I have to do my best pronunciation that I can muster here. But Bayerischer Landesverein für Familienkunde e.V. So that is, I'm going to spell each word out. Bayerischer is Bayerischcher. Landesverein is Landesverein. And für is F-U umlautet R, which is 4. And Familienkunde is their word for genealogy. Familienkunde. And then the society, as many do, has the equivalent of incorporated following it, which is a small e period and a capital V period. And for that, you could just Google that term or go to, I think it's just dagv.org, and it will have the membership. Of course, this is a German web page, so you have to put it into English with your computer's ability to translate it for you. But if you go to the list of the, I think it's almost 90 societies, and the Immigrant Genealogical Society is a member society, as is the Sacramento German Genealogical Society. If you go look at the list, I think the Bavarian Genealogical Society is number 2 or 3, because what they did was they assign you a number in the order in which you apply to become a member. So interestingly, IGS is not the most recent, but I think it's next to most recent.
Okay, and then Gordon, how would you like people to contact you?
GordonSeyffert@mac.com, mac.com.
And I've placed that in the chat.
Okay.
All right,
I've
Gail,
also-
I think we're ready for your closing remarks.
Okay, just a note to our attendees. I've also put a number of the references that Mr. Seyffert referenced in today's talk in the chat, so make sure you do save the chat. Thank you to Mr. Seyffert for all his insights into so many issues that arise in researching our German ancestors and for all his suggestions on how to find answers. This program has been recorded and the recording will be available soon on the Santa Cruz Public Library's YouTube channel. Thank you for being with us for today's program. Please join us again on the first Tuesday of November. That's November 1 at 1 p.m. for Daniel Modell's presentation on the history of the Ebert family and their longtime local business. And just a reminder, although today's program does not include a handout, you may access available handouts from earlier programs by visiting the Genealogical Society of Santa Cruz County website and clicking on lectures and handouts. The website address is in the chat, and I won't repeat it here. When you visit the Genealogy Society website, you will also find membership application forms there. And if you are not already a member of GSSCC, we cordially invite you to join our society. We look forward to welcoming new members. To register for future programs, all you need to do is enter your first and last name, your email address, and then click on the optional small yes box, which allows the Genealogical Society to send you more information about a variety of events you might be interested in attending. Once you click the blue register button, you will receive the Zoom information for the next program. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon.